the torment inside me. It's not just because of me, it's not just because of the world outside, it's because of some meaning that's been formed around my relationship with the world. Feeling a frustration onto their activity. Their activity is neutral.
Right.
If a goldfish is watching that person, then it won't be frustrated. Or
Right.
if, for my PhD, immunology based, so we were looking at white blood cells and how white blood cells tell the difference between something that's safe, like a healthy cell from inside my body, and something that's a threat, like a harmful bacteria, or something that needs tidying up. When a change happens in the environment, the cells have to sense that and send a message to the genes to say, okay, let's dial up something to, I don't know, to help me digest sugar better or help me digest fat better. The environment that we are exposed to has a very powerful effect. There's so many things in influencing our health, have been around for thousands of years, new practices that are developing. I think it's an exciting time that there's so many areas of research that are converging together.
Welcome to the Health, Vengeance and Harmonies podcast. I'm Leonardo Muller-Rodriguez, a PhD student exploring the intersections between neuroscience, music therapy and sleep. A quick mention of the inspiration behind this podcast before I introduce my guest. It's following the concept of a philosopher called René Girard, which is mimetic desire. So he believes that this is the force guiding all social emotions and social interactions and human design in general, which is imitation, wanting to imitate. There's a positive end of wanting to imitate, and that is compassionate and empathetic behaviors, whereas the negative end, there's rivalry and scapegoating, so on the towards the people we imitate and our similars. So that's the inspiration behind this podcast. But here today, I'm honored to host Dr. Ian Tennant, who holds a PhD in inflammation, has 20 years of experience as a therapist, very interested in lifestyle interventions to help with health. You even won a bronze medal as a massage competition. You're a biomedical science lecturer at Anglia Ruskin University, and you're very interested in different aspects of health and mental health, but your main focus is interoception, which is this self-awareness, a sense of the inner body or the inner self. I read your book, which dives into this inner sense, especially the inflammation aspect. So speaking of the book, I will put a link to your Anglia Ruskin website describing more in detail what you do, but you also have a podcast called The Inner Sense, Know Your Inner World. I've been diving deep into a few of your episodes, very fascinating ones about spirituality, quantum science. There's the recent one that you watched, that you've uploaded. Very good stuff to look into. And your book, which is today's topic, Restoring Balance, which I found a very holistic view of health. How else would you describe yourself?
Thank you, Leonardo. It's a great pleasure to speak to you again. And so how else would I describe myself? Well, I just want to talk about how we met to start off with. So it was a kind of fortuitous sort of encounter. I am involved in something called the Active Inference Institute, where you were presenting at their 4th International Symposium before Christmas. And when I was looking at the lineup for all the speakers, I saw your profile and then noticed that you are studying and doing your PhD at the very centre, which is based at the very same university I work at, on a different campus. So we've been connected via the Active Inference Institute, which is kind of more US based, even though we are pretty much sitting next to each other.
Yeah. We had to go across the Atlantic.
That's it. Yeah. So it's interesting how the internet facilitates, the coming together of people who might be geographically very near, but they wouldn't have met each other without the internet. So I find that really interesting.
Yeah, the common interests. we can find
common interests.
communities online with that. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's
So
great.
the topic of this podcast is sort of the mimetic theory. When you were describing that, it reminds me of something that inspired me many years ago in the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. I think I was in my late teens, maybe first year university or something like that, and I was reading this very popular text, Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and it was talking about I think they described it as the mirror tendencies, but the idea is that all of these powerful emotions we have, but even the negative ones, as you've mentioned, like that can lead to things like scapegoating or jealousy or
Mm,
um, ill feelings towards other people. Um,
mm,
in that book, they describe it as being to do with a kind of reflection or mirror, which I suppose is similar idea to mimetic. The idea of mimetic is that what we are seeing in the outside world can be very similar to what we're experiencing in ourselves, but we might attribute a different meaning to it. So if I see something in somebody else that I can identify with, but I might have a bad feeling about it. I can, maybe blame that person as being the cause of that bad feeling when actually it's something that's arisen within me.
mhm,
And, all those years ago, that idea in the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying gave me it appealed to me, and I found it soothing because it almost helped me understand the on some level. I didn't have the solution to my troubles. It helped me have a beginning that, okay, my suffering, the torment inside me is not just because of it's not just because of me. It's not just because of the world outside. It's because of some meaning that's been formed around my relationship with the world.
mm,
Um, and yeah, the book Restoring Balance. It was started writing it in 2017. I'd taken a long break from academia, um, and I'm now back in academia and enjoying learning about the latest advances in understanding human health. But I'm also strongly influenced by, have been around for thousands of years, new practices that are developing that maybe don't have a clear consensus sort of scientific. There's not an agreement yet about how they work and what use they have, but I think it's an exciting time that there's so many areas of research that are converging together to
definitely.
help us understand the predictive way and the way that humans make meaning out of what they sense. Um,
Mm,
so
mm, fascinating. Fascinating. Um, Makes me think of when we had our last chats. You also mentioned that this mirroring aspect is also present as the concept of projections in the therapeutic context. Um, and
yeah, so there's this. It's hard sometimes to translate between different um, fields of work. So yeah, in the therapeutic world, we have this idea of projecting onto somebody or something else. So it could be that I get angry with a colleague because they say certain things or act in a certain way. Um, but there's nothing inherently um, frustrating about what they're doing. It's frustrating to me.
right,
I'm projecting the frustration onto their activity. Their activity is neutral.
right,
if a goldfish is watching that person, then it won't be frustrated. Or
right.
if their best friend was watching that person, it wouldn't be frustrating. But for me, it's frustrating, and I'm projecting that frustration onto the person.
That's very interesting, and it'll tie into all the lifestyle interventions or lifestyle. We'll go in more detail, meditation, for instance, but also the fact that this these actions are, it's more a physical thing happening that has no meaning, and the frustration is this is coming from our inner world, which is what you are very interested in, the interoception aspect. So our emotional reactions are just because we have a subjective aspect, which is a very important aspect of our life, but it's
Yeah.
good to distinguish. And I think, yeah, this ties in very nicely with the exposome, because you've introduced this, I don't know this concept before your book, but you mention it as all the influences that we have to our inner world. It's
Mm.
also, it's external with the actions of other people, but also internal. And
Yeah, the exposome is again, it was something that I hadn't heard of that word until I was researching for the book.
uh
And the exposome, it's a development, I suppose, that's come from the science of genetics, which originally, when I was completing my PhD
do you
in the early
remember the?
2000s,
You
I
probably
think
do remember the topic, but what was the title of the topic?
for my PhD, it was
Yes.
it was immunology based. So we were looking at white blood cells and how white blood cells have two roles. So one role is to go around like a Pac-Man and eat up bacteria, and the other role is to do some housekeeping in our body. So it gobbles up our dying cells and debris. So we were looking at how do the white blood cells tell the difference between something that's safe, like a healthy cell from inside my body, and something that's a threat, like a harmful bacteria, or something that needs tidying up, like a decaying cell.
Mm.
So, it must have a way to distinguish between threat and safety, which arguably that's what we're doing all day when we're interacting with whole humans as well. I'm looking at you thinking, oh, Leonardo, he's a friendly guy. We've got lots in interest, so I'm going to spend some time with him. I'm not going to run away. And that's what's happening inside our body. So when I was finishing my PhD, the or halfway through it, the genome project was coming to completion, and um, even years before that, there was the original dream of the genome project is once we've sequenced all of the DNA in the human body, we will understand the rule book, the instruction book for building a human, and then it'll just be a matter of correcting all the errors when there's a mutation, or tweaking things, and we'll solve all of the health problems for humanity. And it was an amazing dream. But even before the genome project was completed, it became very clear that understanding that instruction book is only part of the story. They soon learned that once you have the whole genome, you need to understand what those genes produce, so the proteins that they produce. And then when you understand the proteins, you need to understand how they interact with each other. So they went from genome project to proteome project to the what they call the interactome. So it's looking at the relationships with the proteins. And then at the same time, there was an understanding of something called epigenetics, which one of the students, PhD students who was working at the same time as me, she was studying epigenetics in yeast cells. And it was a very fringe area of study at that time. But that idea is that it's not just understanding what genes code for, we have to understand how they are turned on and turned off and dialed up and dialed down.
Mm.
And part of the um, set of conditions that will dial up or dial down or switch genes on and off come from the environment. So um, the cells, when a change happens in the environment, the cells have to sense that and send a message to the genes to say, okay, let's dial up something to, I don't know, to help me digest sugar better or help me digest fat better. So even then, there was this idea that the environment is important, and the exposome idea is an extension of that. The environment that we are exposed to has a very powerful effect. So we can't just look at our genes and expect to find all the answers. We have to look at how the environment is interacting with us to alter gene expression. So so yeah, this is the challenge really with uh, living systems or systems in general, that they're not just a straight line. A doesn't lead to B, doesn't lead to C. There's these feedback loops and multiple loops all interacting with each other. And if you just focus on one part of a loop and try to fix what we think is a problem with that one part and ignore all the rest, then we don't know what the consequences are to the rest of the system, or we might not even be targeting the right bit to get the effect we want. So it's the exposome really is, I guess, an appreciation that there's so many things influencing our health, and that it's really important to look at all of them together and how they interact, as well as what's going, the inner workings of the body.
Right. This is fascinating. So there's a nice saying that I read in your book, that the DNA loads up the gun, and then it's the environment that shoots or chooses which genes will be activated or turned off.
Yeah, that's it.
And
So,
so,
for example, let's say someone with this genetic testing is very popular at the moment, and it can give people lots of useful insights about their possible future health. But a lot of the genetically associated risk factors for diseases, let's say breast cancer,
right.
It may give someone an increased likelihood to develop a type of cancer, but it doesn't mean that everyone with that variation of the gene will get cancer. It has to be something else. So this is where I find this information empowering, because it helps people move from feeling like a victim of their genes to saying, okay, this is the situation, but what can I do about it? What can I do to optimize my lifestyle, optimize the way I think and feel, and my relationships, so that my body is best equipped to stay healthy?
That's fantastic. And there are, as you say, different things we can do. There's an outer world and there's an inner world that we can interact with. So, for instance, if we just start with the outer world, the physical or nature and the social environments, you mentioned in your book there are factors like neighborhood we're living in, the education that we've had, the climate that we live in, and those are some aspects from the nature environment, and then how we are exposed to daylight, and this comes down to the sleep and wake cycle, which is called the circadian rhythm, very important for health.
Uh-huh.
And
Just to take that point.
Sure.
So different groups of scientists have different ways of sort of looking at these things. Anthropologists and evolutionary biologists, Daniel Lieberman is one that I'm thinking of. They sort of propose that a lot of the chronic diseases of modern civilizations, they call them mismatch diseases. So they would suggest that the reason why we're getting so many things like diabetes, certain types of cancer, chronic pain, and so on, why so many reasons why the reasons why so many of those are increasing so much is because the environment we've created for ourselves, or the environment that we live in now, is doesn't match very well with what our body is expecting. So,
Oh,
using light as an example, for millions of years, even longer possibly, humans and the evolutionary ancestors of humans have been used to um, natural daylight being the main source of variation in between light and dark. Apart from maybe when we started to harness fire, you'd have some firelight in the evening. It's only really in the last, few decades that we've had so much artificial light at our disposal.
right.
So this is very confusing for our biological rhythm.
Mhm.
Um, and each individual cell in our body has its own clock, its own kind of pace that it goes at. Um, and it may be influenced by lots of things like when we eat and so on, how we move, but the master body clock for the body is set by a small set of neurons in your brain just between your eyes, called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and that receives information from the light around us and kind of sets the rhythm for all the other clocks in our body, all the other organs and cells. So if we give that scrambled message, then it can scramble all the other rhythms in the body.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
that's an example of how we can become our body can become sort of confused about what it should do.
So, yeah, being dysregulated with our sleep really starts to create an imbalance because our brain starts to receive messages of completely non-solar cycles of light. Um, and I mean, this is just talking about the environment, as we're mentioning. Just a little quick note that this is a history of artificial lights, and
Ah,
we're a few million years old as ancestors, right? But the first tubes are about 150 years old. The first light. This was gas lighting at the time. Um, but yeah,
so
that's
yeah, and even those lights, they were probably those types of flames. The full spectrum of those flames was probably a little bit more like a bonfire, or a little bit more like a sunset.
right.
Whereas the modern LEDs, most people will have heard of the idea of blue light blocking, or that your mobile devices emit a lot of blue light, and you may even have a setting on your flat screen device to go into night mode, where it kind of changes the amount of blue versus red light. So that's an attempt by the tech companies to try and correct for the too much blue light. Um, and as you said, it does affect sleep. I think you can just a few nights of being sleep deprived can put a person into a pre-diabetic state, and that shows how
Oh,
potent the effect of disrupting sleep regulation is on something else like blood sugar regulation.
right. That's a few nights only makes you pre-diabetic. That's very impressive. I mean, it's shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I've got type 1 diabetes. I don't know where it came from normally. I got
Oh,
it 3 years ago, but
wow.
yeah. But it's also something I'm very curious about. Like, oh, did sleep contribute to it? Well, that's there's evidence for it, but here's the circadian rhythm that we're talking about. The normal one should be about this solar cycle. Obviously changes throughout the seasons. And well, this is a little insight, I guess, of the complexity of the sleep cycle cellular mechanism or the circadian mechanisms. Is that correct?
Yep, yep. They've even named some of the genes
Mm.
clock.
Clock. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
And this ties in nicely into what is actually happening inside the body when, let's say this hormonal imbalance. People talk about inflammation. You talk about inflammation. But this inflammation, as you mentioned in your book, is actually a constant thing. We're always as you described actually at the beginning of describing your PhD topic, we're kind of always cleaning up and seeing what's happening, and that's inflammation to some very simple description. And the way that this happens is because of a signaling message called redox, simple terms. Yes,
Yeah,
so
so redox is an abbreviation of reduction and oxidation. So they're like kind of like the yin and yang of how we understand electrons to move through the body. So reduction is when an electron is gained, and I'm just looking at your animation there. So
right, yeah,
oxidation is when something loses an electron, and reduction is when something gains an electron. So
okay,
it's a it's inside our cells. The electrons are moving around inside the furnace of your cell, which is where a lot of your food is. Um, the energy is liberated from your food, the mitochondria, which people may have heard about, a very popular topic. So we have these redox reactions, huge amounts of those happening in the mitochondrial membrane, and it's
okay,
necessary really to power the generation of the energy currency inside our cell, known as ATP. So we kind of charge up our cellular batteries by pumping um, positively charged protons to one side of a membrane using the electrons to pump that up. If you think of like a hydroelectric dam, I don't know if you've seen those big
let's put one up.
water-based dams. Yeah, let's see if you can find a picture. So in a dam, we yeah, see
Is
if you
this a good one?
that
This
looks
one
like
here?
a good one. Yeah.
Cool.
So we have a big reservoir of water on one side of the dam, and then when it flows through the turbine, that's used to generate energy. And inside our cells, we have a very similar mechanism. We store, instead of water, we store up all the protons on one side of the membrane, and then it passes through something called the ATPase, which it does spin like a turbine,
Cool.
and that powers the generation of ATP, which your body uses for energy. So we need, in order to create that proton force to pile the water up on one side of the um,
Damn.
dam, we need oxidation to happen,
Okay.
but we need to balance it out. So we can't have too much oxidation. Otherwise, you get inflammation, which is when damage is caused to cells. And conversely, so when I was, 25 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, there was a huge buzz around the idea that inflammation is an underlying cause for many diseases. And that awareness is making its way out into popular culture. Um, so we need to keep a kind of cap on the inflammation in our body because
Right.
it damages the body and then the body doesn't work very well. What's also being understood now is that the other side of that oxidation, the reduction, the RED and redox, that also we need to keep that in balance. So we don't want too much reduction either. We call that reductive stress. So if there's too much oxidation, too much fire in the system, we call it oxidative stress. If there's too much reduction, we call it reductive stress. So you need to keep this balance. You need to kind of stoke the fire and keep it fueled up so that we can carry on living, but you don't want it to be uncontrolled. And
The yin and
the
yang, as you said, of inflammation.
yin and yang, and that's where lifestyle can play a big role.
That's yeah. So again, we can come back to the exposome. So one of the aspects we've mentioned the environments, obviously, but there are things like the inner environment. So you mentioned substances. If you drink alcohol, tobacco, whatever else, inflammation that you get from viruses. I believe that's the kind of thing that could be happening. Your gut, what you're eating. So to be more specific, the microbiome that's in your gut. I even maybe there's all sorts of microbiome I've seen even around. You have sort of an aura microbiome. So I've seen that. I forgot the name
Oh
of that
yeah,
one. Yeah,
yeah, on our skin and all over us. We have microbes all over us, and the aura you're talking about. There's a very interesting uh, study that showed that there's a kind of cloud of microbes
yeah.
emitted from us all the time.
It's interesting. Yeah. Forgot the name of
We
it.
interact with other people, maybe we share
Micro. Yeah, that's right. We were
it,
saying, but maybe not through internet.
not through the internet, no.
Yeah.
Although other types of viral information can be passed through the internet.
Right. Oh well. Yeah. So there is apparently this idea, and so indeed, there's all these inner environments that. So we've talked about external environments such as the light cycle, the artificial light, but also in the inner environments, which can we say fundamentally um, is affecting the redox balance. Is that what's like we can say that all
Yeah,
of these
that's
things like substances, metabolism, microbiome affects us because of the at the redox level.
yeah. When I wrote that book, I was that was the beginning chapters. You said to help people understand how the fire in our body is created and how it needs to be kind of yeah controlled or managed or kept in balance. So energy, we're talking about energy there. So energy is one part of it. And energy really is the ability to do work. So our body needs to create the power to do work, for us to move, for us to build new cells in our body. Um, but that's only one part of the equation as well. We need to have information, the correct information, to harness to sort of channel that energy in the right way. And
Hmm.
then we also need some physical structure, some persisting structures to channel that energy as well. So, more recently, I've been thinking about the triad of information, structure, and energy.
Hmm.
Um, and
Interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
to try and simplify things even more. And that's what this things like this computer are as well. We've got the hardware, we've got the energy supply, so the electricity going into it, and then
Right.
we've got the information, which is the software, and
The
also you
software.
and I feeding information into the computer now.
Hmm.
So I'm really interested in as AI develops, and there's people like Michael Levin trying to say that it's actually a spectrum. There isn't a black and white or a binary division between something like a computer and something like a human. It's not that one is alive and the other's dead. He's proposing that it's more of a spectrum.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, Michael Levin is a very interesting research that he's doing with his bioelectricity, kind of showing that there's a software to how our cells and our body is working. Um, so indeed, there's all these influences on how we manage the energy and maybe managing the information too through our structure of our body. But the fascinating thing of your book, I find, is that you suggest a lot of interventions. Actually, you have a lot of you call them recipes actually, and some are very very interesting. Well, let's just start with the idea of sleep. Just briefly mentioning it, sleep. You describe it as needing that brain shower because you're cleaning your brain during sleep. And that's I love that brain shower analogy. It's fantastic. And then,
Sorry, just to
yeah,
touch on that.
yeah,
Um, what's understood now is that the when we sleep, and maybe at other times of the day, the flow of fluid through the brain
Mm.
changes direction a little bit, like water going in or out of an estuary as the tide changes, and that's really important for the brain to refresh, remove waste products, and for the immune system to stay optimal inside the brain. So it's called the lymphatic
Uh,
system in the brain.
Lymphatic.
Um, yeah, so that's and maybe one day, that those types of understanding, which has come about through imaging of brains, scientific sort of laboratory-based imaging of brains, it will help us understand some of these techniques like craniosacral therapy, which have been around for a long time, and other
Huh.
yoga-based techniques which try to kind of influence the flow of fluid around the brain.
Interesting. Interesting.
And you can kind of sense it. People who do these practices, or therapists, um, claim to be able to sense the movement of fluid throughout the brain. And my experience is that with a bit of practice, you can build the sensitivity to
So
detect that.
that's fascinating. And I think before we dive into these interventions, I'd like to mention that how is it possible that we can, that such practices of meditation or the ones that you mentioned I'd never heard of before, but that are ancient, and the many types of lifestyle interventions one can do, how is it actually possible that as a scientist we can believe that actually works, or as a therapist you want to give it? And it comes back to something you also describe in your book, the fact that our biology, our body, is loads of loops, feedback systems, which is basically we send out something in the environment and we receive the feedback and adjust. A great analogy is a thermostat, automatic thermostat AC system, where let's say you want to keep at 20 degrees your room. You have a thermostat that senses what's the temperature, and depending if it goes up or down, there'll be an automatic loop that will tell you, okay, let's cool down the room, or okay, let's increase the temperature. Basically, this is a feedback system. It's
Uh-huh.
input and it goes down and you get feedback. And that's how it can stay at a certain level, which in biology is called homeostasis. And
Uh-huh.
so this is an important uh, concept to keep in mind before moving to meditation and practice, unless you want to add something regarding
Well,
feedback systems.
yeah, I think that idea of feedback is so important, that there's there's a flow of information and a flow of kind of cause and effect.
Right.
And modern thermostats, or modern ventilation and heating systems, will have maybe have a predictive element to them. And so maybe these days systems are hooked up to another source of information, let's say a weather station, or the
Right.
the weather through the internet, and they can say, okay, there's cold weather coming, so it starts to adjust the
Mm.
it starts to make adjustments before the local temperature changes, um, and this, we could argue, is a natural development of human technology, because humans have this ability to predict, and it's an amazing ability. But it also has a downside as well, because if our predictions are unhelpful, then it causes us, problems, and it might result in disease and ill health and stress and so on. So um, I mentioned in the book the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett, and she's one of many scientists who work on the idea of predictive processing, or in biological terms, we call it allostasis. So it's how an organism adapts to the environment based on the predictions it makes. And I think this is useful for us to understand, because it often feels like we're sensing what's going on and reacting. But it's understood that, like a basic thermostat, it senses a change and then it reacts. But
Mhm.
the majority of the time, we're already acting based on a prediction before we've sensed something. So
Right.
let's say, I don't know about you, but you can maybe think of some friends or family that you have a certain strong emotion about. You might be excited about meeting them, or you might be thinking, "Oh God, not them again." And it's before you even go into their house, you might be thinking about the car journey to their house, and there's already a fluttery feeling in your stomach. And
Right.
again, I'll let you decide whether the example you choose, whether it's an exciting feeling or
Let's promote excitement.
exciting rather than doom and gloom. But for some
Yes.
people, it may be trepidation.
Mhm.
So we haven't even arrived there, and we've already got our body is already creating these adjustments that we experience as butterflies of excitement or uh, no, not again. So, this uh, emotions really are, as we experience them, they are our body's attempt to prepare us for what's coming
Yes.
and to prime the body for what's coming. So that can be really useful. If my stomach starts producing digestive juices before I eat a meal, that's really helpful. But if I'm tying myself in knots about a situation that I think is going to happen, but actually it doesn't actually happen, then that can lead to chronic stress, and that can lead to too much inflammation, and that can, lead to diseases. So bringing that back to ancient practices, um, let's say the gurus or the yogis who sat meditating for years on end, they, by turning their attention inwards, they were noticing these patterns. They were noticing, the illusion of, maybe they'd call it the illusion um, of the world, because they were saying, actually, what I'm experiencing, the feelings that I'm experiencing, they're not based on always based on what's happening outside there. They're based on what I create inside. I create these feelings and stories and so on. So that's the illusionary nature of reality. But modern science is proving that we it's, Anil Seth calls it a controlled hallucination in his book, Being You. So we have these helpful ways to um, simulate the world and um, make useful simulations, but sometimes they
Perceptions. Yeah.
have errors. Yeah.
So these feedback loops happen all around, from the cellular level all the way to how the brain works, as you just mentioned. And so, by knowing this fact, or this scientific paradigm, we can give some sense to meditative practices and lifestyle interventions, which you suggest, and your colleagues in your book, at least, you suggest, um, comes down to developing self-awareness and interoception is called in scientific wording, and this can be done through meditation, because you can increase your awareness of what's going on inside and therefore create a sort of cascade effect. There's also biofeedback mechanisms that is basically using technology to train this inner sense. And yes, and I think the very interesting point I wanted to add, that when you mentioned this predictive aspect, is the addition of memory actually in the feedback system. So it seems like maybe even cellular level have memory. Maybe it's not a book, that kind of stuff, but it's in the way that they get formed and the structure that memory arises, and that's how they interact with the world, predicting.
I think that's a really important point you've mentioned there about structure being a form of memory,
Right.
because you can think of, a scar on if I cut myself and I have a scar in my muscle, we can consider that a form of memory that alters the way that my muscle will move. So
Right.
it's a form of memory, but obviously there's lots more subtle This doesn't have to be a big gaping, scar, a scar from a big gaping wound. It can be subtle changes that are left on a cell.
Right. Well, fantastic. It's been a pleasure to have you, Ian. What do you have one actionable tip you'd like to tell listeners on how they can improve? I've got one just in case you insist.
I'm just going to say, yeah, maybe the 5 breaths per minute is a
Okay.
nice one. So on YouTube, if you put 5.5 breaths per minute,
Cool.
and you can see these little paces that go up and down like a ball going up and down a hill, and you can use that to breathe in and breathe out. So this breathing at roughly that pace between 5 and 7 breaths per minute. It differs for each person, but that has a massive effect for most people on their nervous system, so it can shift us more into a calm state.
Right.
And that's, you talked about the biofeedback devices. There are lots that, yeah, 5 beats per minute. I can see you've pulled one up there. So
Yes. So for instance, cool. Well, that's easy to
yeah,
find. Fantastic. Yeah, soothing is very important. So that's great. So there's so much more to discuss, and the book is really a good read. I think it has these recipes that are great, so you can have more aspects there. Just again, I will show the book and the podcast that you have. In a sense, great talk. We just mentioned movement, fascia being a very important organ that has to be explored for movement and health. So I'll put a link to this and to your book as well for people to have a look. Thank you so much. Yes, it's been a pleasure.
I'd love to have you on the In a Sense channel as well to learn about
Wow.
your
Yeah.
work on music and groove, because I think that is so important for our well-being, that we connect to other people and we regulate ourselves through rhythm and music and sound.
Well, I love that. I'd love that. I'd love to speak about groove there. Yeah, that'll be fantastic. Well, Ian, thank you so much. And
Thank you.
we'll see
Let's
each other
speak
very
soon.
soon. Yeah, fantastic.
Cheers.
Yeah.